Good evening. You have come this far, and that is enough. No matter how your day went, whether it was too long or simply empty, it is now behind you. From this moment on, there is no pressure, no urgency, just a space between sound and sleep, created especially for you to rest. Today, you're going to hear an old story, but one that never gets old. The legend of Avalon and King Arthur, a narrative that lives between the real and the imagined, between the mist and the sword, between what happened and what is perhaps just wishful thinking. And no, you don't have to watch it. No screens shining in your face. Put your phone aside, turn the screen down, or just put on your headphones and lie down as if there was nothing but the sound of my voice. If you like what I'm doing here, if at any point this story brings you comfort, clarity, or sleep, then yes, you can subscribe, but only if it touches your heart. Long before Camelot, before the sword and the round table, Britain was a field of ruins, a continent without a compass, divided into small kingdoms that fought each other for pieces of land, out of pride or sheer habit. There was no order, only promises of power, made by men who could barely keep their own castles standing. The Roman Empire had been gone for centuries, leaving behind cracked roads, disbanded legions, and a vacuum of authority that no one knew how to fill. What was left was an echo, a noise of past glories, and a constant fear of tomorrow. Amidst this chaos, a name began to be whispered in the taverns, in the forests, and even among the priestesses who lived on the fringes of the world. A name still faceless, uncrowned, but full of expectation. A boy, they said. A chosen one, not by blood, but by something older, something that not even the gods seemed to fully understand. No one knew where he would come from, only that he would come, because chaos was tired of itself, and even the cruelest kingdoms yearned for meaning. Meanwhile, deep underground, someone was working in silence. Merlin, a man without age, without a homeland, and without sleep. He did not serve kings, answer to churches, or ask permission from the heavens. He just watched and waited, because he knew the world was about to change. And change, even good change, begins with silence. One night, when the moon barely wanted to appear, a baby was left in his care, the son of a queen who could not assume motherhood, the fruit of a union sealed by charms, strategies, and decisions that could never be revealed. This baby would have no palace. He would have no servants. He would grow up far from thrones, in a modest home, among simple people. He would learn about justice before he learned about royalty, about losses before victories, because the throne he would one day inherit would not be made of gold. It would be made of guilt, expectation, and impossible choices. And to carry it, he would need to be more than an heir. He would need to be human, so human that it would break him. But that night, no one thought about it. Merlin just watched the baby sleep, as if he already knew how many wars that small body would carry. The world outside was still confused, impatient, violent. The warlords still shouted, still killed each other for empty titles. But something had already changed. The king still didn't know he was king. The sword was still stuck in the stone, but the story had already begun, and fate, that lazy old man, had already taken the first step. Merlin never slept, at least, not like the others. His body sometimes rested, but his mind remained awake, floating between dreams of a future he already knew, and memories of a past he didn't want to forget. There was no peace for someone who saw time as an open book. The pages didn't turn by themselves. and he was stuck between the chapters. They said he was a magician, a sorcerer, a druid, a prophet. No one knew for sure. Some called him a servant of the devil, others an instrument of the gods. The truth is that Merlin was neither. He was simply someone who understood too much and was therefore constantly misunderstood. He carried within him the weight of all possibilities, the endings that never happened, the beginnings that went wrong, the mistakes he could not prevent. He was a man made of silent attempts. His face didn't reveal his age, not because he was young, but because it didn't matter anymore. His eyes, yes, gave it all away. They were the eyes of someone who had seen empires fall and promises repeated under other names. Humanity had a tendency to repeat the same mistakes with more elegance. Merlin was no longer impressed by pretty speeches or flags fluttering in the wind. He knew that, deep down, it was all just fear disguised as ambition. Even so, he believed, not in perfect kings or glorious destinies, but in the possibility of doing things differently. And so, he decided to prepare that boy carefully. Arthur would grow up without knowing who he was, but his every gesture would be shaped with intention. He would learn to listen before speaking, to observe before judging, to carry a sword only when it was unavoidable, because Merlin knew that the throne didn't need another strong man. It needed someone who felt. Sometimes, Merlin would wander away. He would wander through the forests, as if searching for answers in dead leaves or crooked branches. And in a way, that was exactly what he was. He believed that nature spoke to those who listened. Trees told ancient secrets. Streams murmured of cycles that men had forgotten. True magic did not come from complicated words or dramatic rituals. It came from silence, from time, from listening. And it was in that silence that he foresaw the pain. He knew that Arthur would bring hope, but also tragedy, that his reign would be remembered, but would come at a high price, that the sword would make him king, but would not save him. Merlin saw the end from the beginning, and yet he did not give up, because sometimes beauty lies in planting, even when you know you will not reap. Some said he was cold, calculating, distant, but they didn't see the nights when Merlin watched over Arthur's sleep as if he were a distressed father, nor the moments when he spoke to the moon, as if asking for advice that would never come. He carried the boy in his eyes like someone carrying a burning flame in the middle of a storm. He knew that, sooner or later, the world would try to extinguish it. His mission was to protect that light until it was strong enough to shine on its own. Merlin didn't want glory. He didn't want statues or legends. He knew he would be forgotten, or worse, turned into a character. History always edits wizards. It turns wisdom into spells, anguish into mystery. He accepted this because in the end, he wasn't doing it for himself. He did it because he had believed in a dream, not of a perfect kingdom, but of a less cruel world. And so, he went on, between one time and another, taking care of a king who still didn't know he was a king, talking to animals, talking to the wind, observing the stars, as if trying to remember where he came from. And in each gesture, there was a silent melancholy. Merlin knew that every choice would have a cost, but even so, he chose to continue, because someone needed to watch over dreams before they turned into nightmares. The sword appeared one morning. No one could say how or from where. It was simply there, stuck in a stone in the center of a forgotten courtyard, among ruins and tall grass. a piece of metal embedded in the rock as if it had grown there, like an iron tree. On its blade, an inscription, "He who pulls this sword from the stone will be the true king of Britain." There was no ceremony, no trumpet sounding, just the sword, the silence, and the astonishment of those who saw it first. Soon, word spread. Warlords, barons, knights with long names and bigger egos rushed to the scene. One by one, they tried to pull the blade out, some with brute force, some with prayers. No technique worked. No shouting made any difference. The sword stood still, indifferent to muscle, title, or pretension. It was as if the stone laughed inside, mocking those who thought royalty was a matter of blood or valor. And while the powerful took turns humiliating each other, Arthur went on with his life, far away. A boy raised without knowing who he was, serving as a squire for one of the least notable knights in Britain. He woke up early, carried shields, cleaned armor, looked after horses, and listened in silence to the adults' conversations about power, wars, and inheritances. He did not see himself as part of that. He thought his destiny was small, made of discrete obligations and distant dreams. It was during one of these obligations that everything changed. In the middle of a tournament, his knight realized he had forgotten his sword. He sent Arthur to fetch it, running through the streets of uneven stones, trying to remember where they had left the object. Arthur passed by that strange stone and saw the blade alone, shining in the sun. He didn't think twice. He walked towards it with the naturalness of someone picking up a tool, like someone picking up a twig from the ground, and he pulled. There was no thunder, no heavenly light, only the sound of metal sliding smoothly, as if the sword had been waiting for that very hand. When he looked around, he realized that the world had stopped. People stared at him in silence, as if time had frozen for a second. The disbelief was immediate. A boy? Just some squire? Someone with no nobility, no title, no history. The first few days were chaotic. There was denial, accusations, theories. They said it was a trick, that the sword was loose, that it was all manipulation. But Merlin knew. He watched from afar, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen the moment before it happened. For him, it wasn't a miracle. It was a consequence. Arthur hadn't been chosen by chance. It was precisely because he didn't want the throne that he was ready for it. Still, accepting the crown was not simple. Arthur hesitated. He wondered if it was right, if it was fair. He wondered why him, and not someone else. He did not understand why such a simple, effortless gesture carried so much weight. Merlin, with his rugged patience, explained that the gesture itself was symbolic. The sword did not test strength. It tested intent, and only someone without a desire for power would be able to wield it with the necessary balance. Arthur was crowned against his will. The people watched him, with eyes divided between hope and doubt. He didn't look like the previous kings. He was young, thin, a little lost, but there was something different in his eyes. A kind of listening, a vulnerability that wasn't weakness, but sensitivity. And over time, that began to make a difference. The sword, named Excalibur, became a symbol, not only of authority, but of something deeper. It reminded everyone that true power is not imposed, but accepted, that the throne is not for those who wish to rule, but for those who can bear the weight of being a symbol. Arthur was not the strongest warrior, but he was perhaps the only one willing to doubt himself, and this doubt, silent and constant, made him human, and for that very reason, a king. The stone was left empty, a marker without a blade, a reminder that the impossible sometimes only needs a simple look, and that, from time to time, the world chooses the improbable because it is tired of those who think they are inevitable. Camelot was not born ready. There were no magical walls or golden towers waiting for Arthur. What existed was an uneven terrain between hills and rivers where the winds blew as if they already knew what was coming. When Arthur decided to found his kingdom there, many laughed. They said it was too far away, difficult to defend, with little strategic value, but he was not interested in military logic. He wanted a symbol, a new space where old disputes would not have roots. Camelot would be that, a new beginning. Stone by stone, the castle was built, not as a fortress, but as a shelter. The halls were wide, made for dialogue. The corridors, of course, the doors, wide. Arthur insisted that a king should be seen, heard, accessible. His ideas were simple, but dangerous. Nobles did not like to share space. Knights did not want equality. Still, he persisted, not because he was too idealistic, but because he did not know how to govern any other way. In the center of the castle, he had a table built, round, without a headboard, without a throne, a space where no one was above anyone else. The round table became a legend before it was even finished. The noblest knights of the kingdom would meet there, not the strongest, nor the richest, but the most just. At least that was the intention. And for a time, it worked. Camelot became synonymous with justice, a kingdom where the laws applied even to the king, where decisions were discussed out loud without whispers behind the curtain. The population began to arrive little by little. Peasants, merchants, outsiders, people fleeing wars, abuses and disappointments. In Camelot, they found order, food, and a listening ear. It was not much, but it was more than any other kingdom offered. Arthur walked through the fairs, talked to the old people, listened to the children. Sometimes he made mistakes. Sometimes he hesitated, but he always went back to correct them. His government was based on trial and transparency, and for this, he earned the respect of those who had never respected any crown. But the beauty of Camelot was not in its towers, nor in its banquets. It was in the illusion it sustained, the idea that power could be good, that the strong could protect, not dominate. That order could be built by listening, not by fear. It was a fragile idea, hard to maintain, but for a time, it worked, and that time, however brief, was enough to make it a myth. The knights began to arrive, some for honor, some for fame. Lancelot was one of the first, a man with a calm gaze and a swift sword. He brought with him absolute loyalty, and a burden that would only reveal itself later. Others came from distant lands, with names that sounded like promises. Gawain, Percival, Bors, Galahad, all different, all seemingly made for a play that was still being written, and all sat at the same table, without a throne, without a crown, without privileges. Merlin watched everything with attentive eyes. He knew that even the purest dreams have cracks. He knew that this harmony would not last forever, but he said nothing. Sometimes you have to let the ideal flourish, even if you know it will wither, because there is a beauty in seeing the impossible happen, even if only for a short time. And Camelot was that, a glimmer of balance in a world accustomed to chaos. Guinevere arrived later, a gentle but firm presence. She was not just a queen, she was a conscience. She raised questions, pointed out limits, demanded more than public smiles. Arthur admired her, not for what she represented politically, but for the clarity with which she saw the world. Together, they formed an unlikely pair. He, a symbol of order. She, a reminder that all order is fragile, and this silent tension sustained part of what made Camelot work. But behind the music and the parties, something was beginning to build up. Small silences, averted glances, stifled conflicts. The harmony was real, but delicate. All it took was one misinterpreted gesture, one difficult choice, for everything to start falling apart. And Merlin knew that this moment would come, because every ideal carries within itself its own destruction, not out of malice, but out of exhaustion. Keeping hope alive requires more effort than wielding a sword. Still, for a time, Camelot shone, and for that alone, it was worth it. Guinevere arrived in Camelot as a pledge of alliance, but she quickly became much more than that. She wasn't a political pawn or a trophy. She was a presence. She carried a kind of calm that didn't ask permission. It just happened. When she walked through the castle gates, everyone understood, not because of her beauty, although she was beautiful, but because of the way she walked, as if she already knew that this place would break who she was, but she decided to stay anyway. Arthur received her with the respect he usually offered to everyone, but with her, there was something different. A hesitation, an attempt to understand before simply acting. He was a man accustomed to swords, advice, and strategy. Guinevere brought a different logic made of pauses, calculated words, a look that saw beyond facades. She was not there to smile in ceremonies. She was there to observe, to question, to remind the king that perfection has an expiration date. The wedding was discreet. Like everything involving Arthur, there was no ostentation, just a gathering of important names, a restrained banquet, and a respectful silence. But in the corridors, rumors began to grow. Some thought she was too cold, others that she was demanding. There were those who said they didn't trust her. The truth is that Guinevere caused discomfort because she didn't bow down. She had an opinion, and more dangerous than that, she had influence. Over time, she became a quiet advisor, not in formal meetings, but in late-night conversations, when the halls were empty and the throne was just a chair. Arthur listened more than he spoke when they were together, not out of submission, but out of respect. Guinevere made him see what he preferred to ignore, the contradictions of the kingdom, the cracks in the ideal, the dilemmas between justice and loyalty. He trusted her because she was not afraid to disagree. But then came Lancelot, the perfect knight, brave, ethical, serene, the mirror of what Camelot wanted to be. When he arrived, the impact was immediate. He brought victories, absolute loyalty, a code of honor that impressed even the most cynical. It was impossible not to admire him, and perhaps that is why what came next was inevitable. What begins as admiration, over time, finds openings for something more. Guinevere and Lancelot were not victims of a sudden passion. No secret meetings in the moonlight. What existed between them was more subtle. It grew in silences, in glances exchanged during councils, in small gestures. She respected him. He listened to her, like few others. And in the space between these two things, something was born that no one dared to name, not even them. Arthur noticed. He wasn't naive, but he wasn't paranoid either. He knew that ruling involved giving up a lot of things, including total control over one's affections, and deep down, perhaps he knew that it was inevitable. He loved Guinevere, in a deep but solemn way. And perhaps what she needed was something more earthly, less of a symbol, more of a human being. Lancelot was that, the human within the myth. Still, nothing was said. No accusations, no confessions. The tension was palpable, but unspoken. The harmony of Camelot required sacrifice, and all three knew it. Each gave up a little of themselves. Guinevere, her freedom; Lancelot, his peace; Arthur, his heart. And for a time, that sacrifice sustained the kingdom. But too much silence becomes a burden, and sooner or later, the burden cracks the surface. The absences began to multiply. Lancelot spent more time away, on missions that seemed self-inflicted. Guinevere became more reserved, more rigid, as if compensating for something. Arthur, in turn, immersed himself in work, in politics, in the role of king, distancing himself from the man he once was. Camelot still shone on the outside, but inside, something was already beginning to crumble. Lancelot arrived in Camelot riding a gray horse, his armor too clean for someone who had just come from the battlefield. He brought silence as his companion, and a look that seemed older than his face. He was a knight, but not one of those who shouted bravado or raised swords for no reason. He was a man who hesitated, and for that very reason, Arthur received him with immediate respect, a silent respect, the kind that does not require promises or oaths of loyalty. One only had to look at Lancelot to know that he carried the code of honor like an invisible scar. He was quick in combat, calm in discussions, fair in decisions, and handsome. Handsome in a way that was disturbing, not because of his appearance itself, but because of the way he made everything seem easy. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it left others speechless. It was as if he didn't fully belong to that world, as if he was always torn between duty and something he couldn't name. Lancelot was a reflection of what Camelot wanted to be, firm, whole, without cracks, and for that very reason, his burden was enormous. Arthur admired him, not just as a knight, but as a friend. There was a rare trust between them, forged in battle and long nights of difficult counsel. Arthur knew he could count on him. He knew that Lancelot would do whatever it took, even if it cost him dearly. But the king also knew, deep down, that no one carries such righteousness without a price, and the price would soon be shown. The problem was never Guinevere, or at least, not only. The problem was that Lancelot, the mirror of virtue, was also human. And when you are so close to the queen, every day, hearing her silences, seeing her doubts, feeling her absence, it is impossible not to be touched. Guinevere and Lancelot never planned anything. They never said what they felt. But the absence of words sometimes says more than 1,000 confessions. He blamed himself for it, with a kind of guilt that made no noise but weighed heavily on every gesture. He avoided her gaze. He distanced himself at parties. He accepted missions in distant kingdoms just to escape the temptation of staying. But the feeling didn't diminish with distance. It grew, and the more he ran away, the more he found himself trapped by what he couldn't have. Lancelot tried to follow the code. He tried to be the perfect knight, but perfection is a trap. The more you try to achieve it, the more you realize how unattainable it is. And it ate at him, because he knew he was moving away from the ideal he had helped build. Camelot shone, but inside him, everything was fog. The other knights noticed. Some were envious, others were afraid. Lancelot's figure was too big to be ignored, and his closeness to the queen, even if discreet, fueled rumors. But no one dared to confront him, because they knew that he, more than anyone else, suffered from it, and because deep down, they needed him. They needed the myth he represented. Arthur was still silent, not because I ignored him, but because I still believed. I believed in Guinevere. I believed in Lancelot. And more than that, I believed that love, no matter how complicated it was, didn't have to be a crime. Even so, the silence between the three of them began to grow, an elegant abyss, full of restrained gestures and interrupted sentences. Lancelot was slowly becoming a stranger within the castle he had helped to build. In battle, he remained impeccable, but outside of battle, he was just a tired man, tired of balancing what he felt and what he should be, tired of sustaining the image of something he could no longer represent, tired of loving in silence. And so, the purest night in Camelot also became the most divided, a cracked mirror, perfectly reflecting all the contradictions of a kingdom that dared to dream too big. Not all stories of Camelot were forged in stone or blood. Some were born from water, from immovable surfaces that hide ancient depths. The story of Excalibur, for example, does not begin in stone. It begins in the lake, or rather, in a woman who lived within it. No one knew her true name. She was called only the Lady of the Lake, a figure between magic and silence, who appeared when the world needed to remember that there were forces older than the kingdoms of men. She never aged. Her hair looked like liquid shadow, and her eyes reflected like mirrors. She didn't talk much, but she didn't need to. Everything about her seemed to exist in a different time, not in the past or the future, but in a deep now, where things simply are. Merlin knew her, or at least, he knew her presence. He never said where she came from, or what exactly she was. He just warned. The Lady of the Lake didn't give anything away for free. She was the one who handed Excalibur to Arthur, and that detail changes everything, because the sword in the stone was a symbol of legitimacy. But Excalibur was different. It was an extension of the kingdom's own will. It had a shine that didn't come from metal, a coldness that didn't hurt, only reminded. It reminded that power, even when necessary, has consequences, and that every time you lift a blade, something is lost. The Lady of the Lake didn't explain this to Arthur. He just stepped out of the water, raising his sword arm over the calm waves, as if to say, "Do you really want this?" Then hold on. When Arthur first touched Excalibur, he felt the weight not only of the weapon, but of everything it represented. It was like carrying his own destiny in iron form. The blade was perfect, balanced, almost alive. It didn't just cut the body, it cut illusions. With it, the king would win battles, unify lands, write legends, but he would also make mistakes. And each mistake, with that sword in his hand, would leave scars that would not heal with time. The Lady of the Lake disappeared after that. She vanished into the mists, as she always did. She didn't ask for thanks, or an explanation. It just left a sense that something bigger had happened. Merlin didn't comment. He just watched. He knew that true magic couldn't be contained in words. Excalibur wasn't just a weapon. It was a constant reminder that even the chosen must be held accountable. Arthur kept the sword close to him, but he rarely used it. He preferred to resolve conflicts with words. It was his way of resisting the temptation of easy power, and perhaps for that reason, the sword respected him. It never weighed more than necessary. It never vibrated without reason, but it was always there, silent, ready, as if waiting for the moment when it would be called upon for something greater than war. The knights spoke of it as if it were sacred. Some believed that Excalibur granted invincibility. Others thought it was cursed. None of them were completely right. The truth is that Excalibur amplified. What was inside the one who held it became visible. A just king, with it, became a symbol. A corrupt heart, with it, would become a tyrant. It was a sword, but also a mirror. Lancelot, although he respected the blade, kept his distance, perhaps out of fear of what it would show. Guinevere, when she first saw it, was silent. Then she simply said, "She is beautiful, but she does not look happy," and no one has ever forgotten that phrase. Over time, the legend grew. Excalibur became a name whispered even in distant lands. Enemy kingdoms trembled at the mere thought that the king of Britain wielded a sword that had been pulled from the bottom of a lake, and, ironically, this made Arthur use it less and less, because he knew that symbols, when used too much, lose their power. But the power was there. It had always been there, and at the bottom of the lake, beneath the waters that never stopped moving, the lady watched, as if waiting, as if knowing that everything that is given will one day be demanded. Before becoming a sorceress, before becoming a threat, Morgana was just an ignored girl, daughter of a queen, half-sister of a king, raised behind the scenes of a story that always preferred men. From a young age, she learned that too much presence was annoying. That wisdom in a woman's voice was mistaken for a challenge. That magic, when not used to please, became an accusation. She observed the world with eyes that were too attentive for those who lived on the margins, and that, for many, was already dangerous. Unlike Arthur, Morgana was never raised to sit on the throne. But she was not raised to be silent either. She spent part of her childhood in convents, then among druids, priestesses, scholars, and wanderers. She learned to read the winds, the stars, and bodies. She knew how to heal. She knew how to poison. She knew how the gears of power worked, even when she could not touch them. She did not want to destroy the kingdom. She only wanted to exist within it. But for a woman like her, that was already seen as a threat. When Arthur ascended the throne, Morgana returned to Camelot, not as an enemy, not yet. She wanted to meet the man behind the myth, to know if the brother who never had time to be a brother could be more than a symbol. Arthur received her cautiously. He didn't know how to behave with her. There was affection, yes, but also distrust. Morgana didn't hide her knowledge, nor her opinion, and that made the advisors sweat uncomfortably. Guinevere, oddly enough, liked her. She saw in Morgana something she also felt in herself, the constant struggle to be taken seriously in a world that pretended to listen. They talked at night, far from the halls. They talked about everything. The contradictions of Camelot, the men who occupied all the places, the decisions that demanded sacrifices that were always silent. Guinevere understood Morgana, but understanding her was not the same as controlling her. Little by little, Morgana's presence began to bother people. She questioned the laws. Merlin tried to protect her, to a certain extent. He saw in Morgana a rare intelligence, a connection to ancient forces that even he respected. But he also realized that she carried a growing pain, a wound that would not heal. And deep wounds, when ignored for too long, turn to poison. Not because the person wants them to, but because no one can stand being erased forever. It was in this tension that Morgana began to pull away, not in body, but in intention. He was still in Camelot, but his eyes were already elsewhere. She began to study alone, to speak less, to act more. Her allies were few, but loyal, people who also felt left out, people who had been discarded by the ideal of purity and honor that Camelot tried to uphold. She didn't want war. Not at first. She wanted the truth to be told, that the kingdom was flawed, that Arthur was human, that myth couldn't hide the cracks forever. But no one wanted to hear it. The people preferred legend. The nobles preferred order. And Arthur preferred silence. He loved his sister, but he didn't know how to fit her into the world he'd built. So he pretended she wasn't a problem. And that, to Morgana, was the ultimate betrayal. Because nothing hurts more than being ignored by the one you love. Morgana became Arthur's dark mirror. Not the opposite, but the reflection of what he tried not to see. Where he preached justice, she pointed out the exceptions. Where he spoke of order, she showed those who were left out. She was the part of the kingdom that did not fit into the dream. And for that very reason, she was necessary. But no one wanted to deal with her. And then, without fanfare, Morgana began to transform. Not out of malice, but because she was tired of waiting. Merlin never liked the title of prophet. For him, predicting the future was less a gift and more a punishment. The truth is that the future never came in a straight line. It arrived in pieces, fragments of scenes, loose phrases, faces that appeared and disappeared as if they were being remembered before they even happened. And the more he saw, the less he wanted to see, because the future, like a cracked mirror, showed everything at once: glory and downfall, hope and despair. The visions came to him during his sleep, when he could sleep at all, or in moments of distraction, when the world seemed to go silent for a second. Sometimes they appeared in reflections of water, other times in whispers of wind, but they never brought comfort. Merlin saw Arthur crowned, surrounded by knights, acclaimed by a people thirsting for order. But soon after, he would see the same crown fall into the ground, stained with blood. He saw Camelot built with rigor and beauty, only to see it in flames under the cloudy sky. And worst of all, he found himself alone, in the end, holding memories that no one else wanted to remember. He tried to ignore it at first. He thought he could change the course of events, like a seasoned boatman diverting the course of a river. But over time he understood that certain currents are stronger than any will. Still, he kept trying, because even when you know the end, the journey still matters. And he loved Arthur, not like a teacher loves a student, but like someone loves a possibility. Merlin saw in Arthur the chance for a less cynical world, and so he could not abandon him. The prophecies, however, were not just about the king. They were about everyone. He saw Guinevere, surrounded by choices no one would want to make. He saw Lancelot leaving and returning, always torn between honor and desire. He saw Morgana raising storms with her own eyes, and he saw Mordred, always Mordred, an unborn boy with cold eyes and small hands, but with a destiny so heavy that even time hesitated before him. Merlin didn't know who the mother would be. He didn't know when the boy would come. He only knew that he would come, and that would bring the end. It was inevitable, like the sunset, like the last chord of a song that was too long. He tried to warn Arthur, but his words were always met with polite patience and a look of doubt. Arthur wanted to believe that fate could be bent with good deeds, that the present was enough to change tomorrow. Merlin wanted to believe it too, but the images wouldn't go away. In the council hall, Merlin would sometimes suddenly fall silent. He would stop in the middle of a sentence and stare at a vague point on the horizon, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The others had gotten used to it. They called it an eccentricity, moments of the wizard. No one asked him what he saw, perhaps out of fear of the answer. In one of these visions, Merlin saw himself older than he had ever been, sitting alone in a forest, surrounded by mist, his voice failing and his hands empty. No king, no castle, no sword, only the sound of leaves and a feeling that it had all been a dream. This was the vision that frightened him the most, not because of the end, but because of the loneliness. Yet he continued. He helped in trials, advised in wars, healed the wounded, calmed spirits. He did what he could, while he could, but deep down, he was preparing for collapse. And this preparation was not made of plans. It was made of silence, of acceptance, because Merlin, deep down, knew that everything that begins must end, and that not even myths escape this. He wrote some things down. On hidden parchments, he used coded words to record what he saw. Not for you, but for the day when someone wanted to understand. Maybe one day, someone would find those writings and realize that the legend of Arthur was not only glory, but also warning. That Camelot was not only promise, but also warning, because Merlin's prophecies were never about predicting. They were about remembering. The Knight's Code looked beautiful on paper. Well-written phrases, lofty ideals, a glow of morality that made even the most skeptical sigh. Justice, loyalty, courage, protection of the weak, truth in words and deeds. It was a list that promised to turn warriors into examples, and for a time, it worked, or seemed to work. Men sat at the round table, with the solemnity of those who believed they were participating in something greater than themselves, and that, in a way, was already a beginning. Arthur took the code seriously, not as an imposition, but as hope. He believed that knights could be more than just armed men. They could be beacons of guidance in a world of shadows. He didn't demand perfection, but effort, and so he chose carefully who sat next to him. Each name carried a story. Some had come from poverty, others from nobility, but all brought with them a hunger for meaning. The code was, for them, a chance for redemption. But it soon became clear that ideals, when they met the real world, trembled. Courage could turn into recklessness. Justice, disguised revenge. Loyalty, pretext for silence in the face of mistakes. And the truth, well, the truth was always the first to be adjusted when pride was at stake. Many knights used the code as moral armor. They recited its rules as if they were reading a spell. But when the time came to choose between right and expedient, the sword almost always weighed more than the oath. Lancelot, for example, was the closest to the ideal. Just, noble, faithful to the king. But inside him, there was a constant war. He knew that, by loving Guinevere, he was betraying his own code, and this gnawed at him in silence. He was the best among them, but also the most divided, and no one understood this contradiction better than Arthur, who preferred not to comment. Gawain was impulsive. He had a good heart, but little patience. His version of justice included settling everything on the battlefield. Percival, the youngest, took the code as absolute truth. He questioned others when they made mistakes, even without understanding the weight of living under so many expectations. Galahad, Lancelot's son, was almost mystical, pure, unshakable, almost disconnected from the real world. He seemed more like a legend than a man, and perhaps for that reason, he was the most solitary. The problem wasn't the code itself. It was trying to apply it in a world of contradictions. It was easy to talk about protecting the weak when the weak had no voice, to talk about truth when truth could destroy alliances, to talk about honor when it cost an innocent person their life. Camelot wanted to be perfect, but perfection, by definition, excludes everything human. Merlin saw this clearly. He watched the knights with a mixture of tenderness and frustration. He knew they were trying. He knew they were failing, and that they would fail more and more as the kingdom grew, as the pressures increased, as love and ambition came to occupy the same space. He did not say it out loud, but sometimes, as he passed the table where the knights were fervently discussing some ethical dilemma, he would mutter to himself, "It is beautiful to see you trying." The people loved the code. They repeated its phrases, used them as consolation. It was comforting to believe that there was a group of noble men caring for the kingdom with purity of soul, even if, in the shadows, the decisions were much grayer, because the truth is that the code served as both a guide and a facade, and few knew where one ended and the other began. Arthur, over time, began to notice the cracks, but he did not back down. He preferred to uphold the ideal, even though he already knew he was shoring up ruins, because he knew that, without that dream, the kingdom would become just another land of armed men and broken promises. So, he persisted. He repeated the principles. He encouraged confessions, mediated disputes. He tried, with the serenity that only someone who carries the world on their shoulders can have. The knight's code was never fully enforced, but it still had value, because even though it failed, even though it contradicted itself, it was a reminder that honor must be chosen every day, and that ultimately it is this constant choice, not perfection, that sustains myths. When the name of the Grail was pronounced for the first time, there was silence, a profound silence, the kind that does not ask for an answer. Legend said it was a cup, or perhaps a stone, or a divine object of uncertain origin. Some spoke of a miracle, others of a metaphor, but everyone agreed on one thing. Finding the Holy Grail would be the final test, the symbol of redemption, the prize for those who truly understood what purity is. It was Percival who brought up the subject. Naive, he still believed that anything could be achieved with sincere effort. He said that in a dream, he saw a chalice shrouded in light, crossing the sky as if searching for a worthy heart. He said he heard voices, that he felt a calling. At first, the knights laughed. Another vision? Another impossible mission. But Arthur did not laugh. He just lowered his head, thoughtful. He knew that a new quest was all that Camelot needed, or all that could destroy it for good. The quest for the Grail spread like wildfire. Each knight interpreted the call in his own way. Some saw it as a chance to prove themselves. Others saw it as redemption for past mistakes. Some simply wanted to escape the growing weight of the court. The truth was, no one knew exactly what they were looking for. But perhaps that was the point. The Grail was less an object and more an absence, a hole in the chest that each tried to fill. Gawain set off in a hurry, believing that the Grail was strong and courageous. 3 weeks later, he was lost in lands that barely spoke his language, facing monsters that seemed to come out of ancient nightmares. Boars, more careful, tried to interpret signs, cross-reference maps, and talk to old hermits who claimed to have seen the light of the chalice. But the more he asked, the less clear everything became. Galahad, silent, walked as if he already knew the way. He was the closest to purity, but also the furthest from the world. Lancelot hesitated. He didn't want to leave. He knew his soul was far from the perfection the Grail demanded. But he went, perhaps because he knew that by staying, he would have to deal with feelings he could no longer hide. And so he wandered, through forests, deserts, ruins. He was tested, tempted, humiliated, and with every step, he felt the Grail watching him from afar, not with judgment, but with silent sadness. Meanwhile, Camelot was emptying. The court, once full of voices and plans, now echoed in silent corridors. Arthur looked at the maps, as if searching for faces and not lands. Each knight who departed left a void, and the king began to wonder if the ideal of purity was not, in fact, a trap. Perhaps the Grail was never meant to be found. Perhaps it was just an excuse to disperse, to test how much one could bear absence. Guinevere felt it too. She walked through the gardens in silence, feeling the wind carry names and faces away. Sometimes she dreamed of the Round Table, whole again, and she woke up with wet eyes, not from sadness, but from a kind of weariness that cannot be explained. She did not believe in the Grail, not as an object, but she understood the desire it awakened, the desire for meaning. Few returned, and those who did returned different. Gawain, quieter. Bors, more skeptical. Galahad didn't return. They say he found the Grail, that he touched the light and disappeared. Others say he simply understood that he didn't belong in this world. Either way, he disappeared. Lancelot also returned, but his eyes didn't carry victory, only a sad humility, as if he had finally accepted that he wasn't the perfect knight. Arthur listened to each story attentively, but deep down, I knew that the true result of the search was not in the answers. It was in the questions that remained. The Grail did not unite the knights, but it revealed their flaws. It showed that even the best get lost when they follow a nameless ideal, and that, perhaps, the most sacred thing is not to find, but to keep searching. Mordred was born in silence. There was no celebration, no announcement, no blessing from the gods. Just a dark night, a hasty decision, and a destiny no one asked for. His mother was Morgana, his father Arthur, but neither of them spoke of it out loud. The moment that brought them together was confusing, shrouded in enchantments, lies, and the manipulation of a night that should never have happened. Morgana knew. Arthur did not, at least not at first. The child was taken away, a maid with no noble name, no golden cradle, but always surrounded by whispers. Mordred grew up hearing fragmented versions of who he was. No one told him everything, but everyone seemed to know more than they admitted. And that shapes a person. Growing up with broken truths makes the heart warp too soon. Mordred learned to watch before he spoke, to distrust before he trusted. He was cunning and lonely. From an early age, he showed signs of unusual intelligence. He knew how to read before others. He knew how to lie too, but not out of malice, out of self-defense. When it's a secret, the truth can be very dangerous. He saw the world through eyes that seemed to understand more than they should, and because of that, many avoided his gaze, including his mother. Morgana, with all her strength, tried not to project onto him the pain she carried, but she didn't always succeed. Her love was real, but it was a tense love, crossed by the bitterness of having given birth to a child not out of desire, but out of destiny. When Arthur finally found out, his reaction was restrained. As always, no scandal, no running away, just that usual silence. The one he used to deal with, what he could not control. He accepted Mordred into his court, as one would accept an old debt. He gave him a place among the younger knights, offered training, titles, everything he could offer, except affection, because he did not know how, because looking at Mordred was, for Arthur, like looking at his own failure. Mordred felt this, and it shaped him more than any sword or book. He was slowly becoming the reflection of what his father feared, not out of cruelty, but out of frustration. He always felt like an outsider. He had power, but he didn't belong. He was of royal blood, but he didn't inherit trust. It was as if he were forever in the shadow of a throne that never fully acknowledged him. The other knights were also hesitant around him. They knew who he was, but they didn't know how to treat him. Mordred used this to his advantage. He learned to listen to secrets, to understand the cracks in the court, to predict the movements of the kingdom as if he were reading a board. He had a talent for strategy, for politics, but he also carried a resentment that grew, even when he tried to hide it. Morgana warned him. She urged caution. She said that Arthur was not an enemy, just a tired man. But Mordred did not want compassion. He wanted recognition. He wanted to be looked at without suspicion, and the more he did not receive it, the more he distanced himself. He began to form his own alliances, discreet but effective. Loyal soldiers, forgotten advisors, dissatisfied nobles. He was not planning a coup, not yet, but he was thinking, and thinking, in certain contexts, is already the beginning of the end. Arthur tried to get closer, in small gestures, a piece of advice here, a mission there, but always with the caution of someone handling a fragile mirror. And Mordred realized this. He knew that, for his father, he was both son and reminder, origin and threat, and there is no bond that grows well under that shadow. Rumors were growing. Some said that Mordred had ambitions for the throne. Others believed that he simply wanted justice. The truth was that even he didn't know for sure. What he did know was that time was running out. Camelot was beginning to weaken. The search for the Grail had upset the balance. The knights were scattered, the people more restless, and in the midst of all this, Mordred saw an opportunity, or a responsibility. It depended on your point of view. The forgotten boy was already a man, and now he was seen, not with love, but with fear. And sometimes, that is enough to make an empire tremble. The betrayal did not begin with an act. It began with silence, with averted glances, with dinners where words were measured, with absences that no one dared to name. Camelot still shone on the outside, but inside, the air was thick. As before a storm, Arthur understood, but did not say. Guinevere felt, but did not admit it. Lancelot, he already knew, and no longer knew what to do with it. For a long time, the three of them pretended that nothing had changed. They maintained their gestures, their roles, their rituals, the queen at the king's side, the knight at the head of the army, the king at the center of everything, trying to maintain the balance of a world that was beginning to slip through their fingers. But there was tension in the air, the tension of someone who carries love, guilt, and doubt all at the same time. Lancelot was trying to distance himself. He took on missions in distant territories, volunteered for battles that didn't require his presence. He wanted to forget. He wanted to be just the knight symbol, the righteous man. But every time he returned, all it took was a gesture from Guinevere for everything to come flooding back. There were no stolen kisses, no whispered promises. It was worse. It was what was never said, and what is never said grows. Arthur watched. He was no fool. He knew them both better than they would have liked. He knew something had changed, and that their silence spoke volumes. But he also knew that to accuse would be to destroy, and maybe, deep down, he preferred silent betrayal to open collapse. So he carried on, as if he didn't see, and it ate at him. The court, of course, was talking. Rumors circulated like smoke, but no one had the courage to confront them. Lancelot's name was still too strong, and respect for Guinevere, even among the most critical, prevented open accusations. Camelot could not afford a scandal, so everyone pretended. And in this collective pretense, the kingdom hung by a thread. Mordred watched everything from afar, and he smiled little, not out of pleasure, but out of understanding. He saw how fragile Camelot's image of perfection was. He knew that all it took was one push, one gesture, one choice, and everything would fall apart. And unlike others, he didn't want to fix it. He wanted to expose it, show that even the noblest people carry shadows, that the king, no matter how just he was also made of flaws. The moment came on an ordinary night. A random informant, an intercepted note, a caught-on meeting. It was nothing grand, just a discreet room, two bodies too close together, and the sound of the door opening too quickly. Enough, just what was needed. Arthur didn't scream. He didn't break anything. He just looked, and his look was sharper than any sword. Lancelot tried to speak. Guinevere tried to stand up, but Arthur's silence weighed heavily, a silence that said it all. Disappointment, sadness, helplessness. He wasn't a king there. He was just a man, losing everything he loved at the same time. There was no more pretending, and that, for him, was the end. The trial was swift. The court demanded order. Some called for the queen's execution. Others, Lancelot's expulsion. Arthur wanted neither, but he couldn't ignore it either. He was king, and the king needed to keep up appearances. Guinevere was sentenced to death for adultery, for treason, for breaking an ideal that the kingdom could barely sustain. But everyone knew it was theater, and even so, the theater needed to be performed. On the appointed day, Lancelot appeared, not with an army, but with pain written all over his face. He fought with those who tried to stop him, not to attack the king, but to save the woman he loved. Guinevere was taken away. Arthur stood there, watching, and inside him, something broke completely. Camelot was never the same again. Guinevere's trial was public, because it had to be, because the people demanded a gesture, because the appearance of order was more important than the truth. It didn't matter what had actually happened. What mattered was what it looked like, and in that moment, it seemed as if the queen had broken something that held her back much more than her throne, the illusion of purity. Guinevere was taken to the center of the square, with her shoulders held high, her face calm, her gaze fixed nowhere. There were no tears, no screams, only a strange serenity of someone who already knew that the end would come like this. She did not defend herself. She did not ask for forgiveness. She also did not challenge anyone. She simply remained, and this posture, for many, was even more uncomfortable than a confession. Arthur watched from afar, sitting on the improvised throne that had been placed there to give dignity to the act. His face was impassive, as befitted a king, but inside he was nothing but ruin. He was no longer a husband, nor a friend, nor a man. He was a role, a symbol, sitting in front of a pain that he could not show, and no one seemed to notice it. Or if they did, they pretended not to see it. As always, the council took turns making accusations. They spoke of treason, of a threat to the stability of the kingdom, of an offense to the sacred. They said that the queen was an example, and for that reason, her error was twofold. They spoke eloquently, with theatrical indignation, as if they needed to convince themselves of their own righteousness. But at no point did anyone ask, what was she feeling? What had led her there? It didn't matter. She was a symbol that had failed, and symbols, when they crack, are frightening. Merlin was not present. He refused to watch. He simply said, I will not witness cowardice disguised as justice. Guinevere knew this, and for a brief second, she smiled. Small gesture, almost imperceptible, but enough to remind her that all was not lost. Lancelot, of course, was far away, in hiding, on the run, considered an enemy, a traitor, a deserter. Yet he was not hated. Many still admired him, perhaps even more so now, because he had done what many secretly wished for, to break the script, to act on feelings, not protocol. And that, as dangerous as it was also liberating. The sentence was not long in coming. Death by burning, not because it was necessary, but because it was symbolic. Fire purifies, they said, as if the problem were her body, as if burning her would erase the collective error of all who pretended too much for too long. Arthur did not intervene, not at that moment. He remained still, as if waiting for time to pass him by. But the night before the execution, he went to the queen's chambers. He entered unannounced. Guinevere was sitting, slowly combing her hair. They did not touch. They did not cry. They just looked at each other. And for a moment, they seemed like two ordinary people, two exhausted human beings. Arthur said little. He asked if she regretted it. Guinevere replied, I regret not having told the truth before. Not about him, about me. He nodded. He understood, because there were also truths he had never told. They remained silent for a few more minutes. Then he left, and she went back to combing her hair, as if saying goodbye to herself. The next morning, everything was ready. The crowd gathered, hungry for a spectacle. Guinevere was led away in silence, her head held high, as always. But before the sentence could be carried out, the sound of hooves rent the air. Lancelot, alone, covered in dust, but with his eyes ablaze. He fought the guards, broke through the line, climbed the gallows, and took her in his arms. You didn't ask permission. You didn't explain. You just carried her. Arthur did not give orders. He did not say anything. He simply stood up and left. And with that gesture, Camelot cracked. It wasn't the escape, nor the betrayal. It was the recognition that the system they had created together was not strong enough to deal with humanity, with error, with love. The trial ended without an end, like the saddest stories, and deep down, everyone knew that nothing there had been resolved. Camelot had survived the trial, at least in appearance. The walls still stood, the banners still flew, the bells rang as if nothing had happened, but those who looked closely could see it. There was an emptiness where there had been music, a tension in the corridors, in the halls, even in the smiles. The court was cracked, not on the outside, but on the inside, And that kind of crack cannot be mended with stone or sword. Arthur changed. He was still king, still just, but something in him had retreated. He spent more time alone, in the gardens, staring at the horizon, as if searching for a way out that did not exist. He spoke less in councils. He avoided looking the knights in the eye. It was as if, suddenly, everything had become noise. Even the throne, once a symbol of stability, seemed uncomfortable. Too high, too cold, too empty. Lancelot was far away, a refugee, in hiding. They said he wandered the forests, living as a wandering warrior, helping peasants, fighting looters. He was still seen as a hero by some, by others as a traitor, but his name was avoided out loud, as if saying it could invoke the memory of what everyone was trying to forget. Guinevere, taken with him, also disappeared from the speeches. It was as if she had never existed, as if the kingdom would rather erase the pain than face it. The knights, once united by a common ideal, began to divide into silences. Some still believed in the dream. Others no longer knew what to believe. The meetings were tense, the smiles forced, and the old glow of the round table became increasingly dull. There were subtle accusations, improvised alliances, suspicions that grew like moss on the walls. Camelot was no longer a kingdom. It was a facade. Mordred's influence grew. I didn't need to raise my voice. His presence was enough to make people uncomfortable. He spoke little, but his words echoed. He showed himself to be loyal, but left enough doubts to be feared. He offered solutions, but his proposals always came with consequences that no one wanted to admit. Arthur, who had previously treated him with polite distance, now kept him closer than he would have liked. He was the only one who still spoke firmly in councils, and because of that, he gained ground. But the king knew. He knew that the greatest danger was not in the armies. It was in the words that were badly spoken, in the wounds that did not heal, in the grief that was not resolved. Wars begin when sadness finds no outlet, and the sadness of Camelot had nowhere to hide. It was on every face, even on the stone floor, that no longer seemed so solid. Merlin tried to give advice, but his voice was no longer the same. He had aged not in body, but in hope. He knew the end was approaching, not by fate, but by exhaustion. Because even dreams, when they demand too much, break. And the dream of Camelot had already bled too much to remain whole. The people felt it. The once loyal fiefdoms began to question. Small rebellions appeared on the edges of the map. Distant lords stopped answering calls. The promises of peace and prosperity lost strength. The people murmured, not with anger, with weariness. And weariness, Arthur knew, is the beginning of giving up. Even so, he resisted. He tried to maintain the structure. He received ambassadors, judged disputes, organized harvests, but it was like keeping a house standing in the middle of a landslide. With each gesture, he felt the ground shift. What had once been a certainty was now a burden. Governing was no longer a vocation. It had become a punishment. It was in this scenario that Mordred began to speak in order, in security, in authority. Words that sounded familiar, but that, coming from him, had a different tone, more rigid, more precise. He said that it was time to restore Camelot's strength, to make the throne feared again, and little by little, he began to convince. Arthur listened in silence. He knew his son wasn't lying, but he also knew that truth without compassion is just another form of tyranny. Still, he let him speak because deep down, he didn't know what else to say. The war, at that moment, had already begun, not in the fields, but in the heart, and these wars are the hardest to win. War came unannounced. There was no decree, no formal declaration. It sprouted like a weed between the cracks in the kingdom, where trust no longer grew. When the first banners rose against the throne, Arthur was not surprised. He simply nodded, like someone who sees a storm on the horizon and knows there is no point in running. It was inevitable. Camelot had resisted for too long. Mordred led the revolt, not with anger, but with conviction. His message was clear. The king had failed, the legend had rotted, and it was time to start over. The justice that Arthur preached had been lost in omission. The glory of the kingdom now seemed like a shadow of an empty dream, and, as harsh as it was, many agreed. Old nobles, disillusioned soldiers, even peasants who no longer saw the point in waiting for miracles. Mordred offered something that seemed more real: firm order, control, clarity, even if it was by force. Arthur hesitated until the last moment. He tried to negotiate. He sent messages, proposed agreements, reminded people of vows, but all of this came too late, because there was a time when the king's word was enough. Now, it was just one among many, and the sword, as always, spoke louder. The battle was scheduled for dawn, an open field shrouded in mist, the kind of place where everything seems suspended, as if the world is still deciding whether to continue or not. The armies lined up in silence. There was little shouting, no provocation, just that odd pause before the inevitable. Merlin watched from afar. He no longer interfered. He was old, and he knew that the end sometimes must happen for the myth to be complete. Arthur was in armor, but he didn't look like a warrior. He looked like a tired king who was dressing for the last time. His eyes were filled with longing, not fear. Lancelot wasn't there. Neither was Guinevere. The other knights were scattered. Some were dead, some were far away. Some were silent in the face of what the kingdom had become. The king was now just him, with his sword and his memory. Excalibur still shone, not as it had before. Its glow was darker, like a reminder of what had been and what might have been. Arthur held it steady, but there was melancholy in the gesture. There was no glory in fighting anymore, only necessity. The battle began with a mistake. One soldier stumbled, another thought it was an attack, and suddenly, swords clashed. The field was thrown into chaos. Dust rose, blood flowed, screams echoed. This was no noble battle. It was confusion, like all real wars. Arthur fought with precision, but not fury. Mordred, on the other hand, fought with purpose, and that made a difference. The meeting between father and son was inevitable. In the middle of the field, among bodies and mud, they saw each other. Arthur hesitated. Mordred did not. The blow came fast, accurate, but Excalibur responded, and in an instant of brutal clarity, both were wounded. The blade pierced Mordred, but his spear found Arthur's side. They both fell. No final words, no heroic speech, just the sound of rarefied breathing and the wind carrying dust. Mordred died first, his eyes wide open, staring at the cloudless sky. Arthur took longer. He was carried by a few loyal followers to the shores of a lake. Merlin was there, silent. He knew what was coming next. The king looked up at the sky, then down at the water. He asked for Excalibur to be returned. The sword was no longer his. It belonged to myth, and myths, when they come to an end, leave no trace on the ground. They disappear into the water. A knight hesitated, but in the end he threw his sword into the lake. It spun in the air, touched the surface, and was caught. An arm emerged from the water, steady, serene, holding the blade before disappearing again. The lady of the lake was still there, waiting. Arthur was placed on a boat, silent, with thin curtains and soft perfumes. In it, women dressed in mourning waited for him. They did not cry. They simply welcomed him, Morgana among them. Perhaps there, at last, as a sister, the boat departed without a sound, cutting through the fog, taking the wounded king to Avalon. The field was empty, the throne ownerless, the dream suspended, but not destroyed. The boat moved slowly. It cut through the water as if it were gliding over a sheet of glass. No sails, no oars, just the soft sound of the lake touching the hull. Arthur's body lay in the center, wrapped in light cloths, his eyes closed, his face serene. He was still breathing, but more and more slowly, as if, little by little, he was letting himself dissolve into time. Around him, the women dressed in black watched in silence. There was no rush. None of them spoke, because some goodbyes don't require words. They require presence. Morgana was among them, not as an enemy, not anymore. The rivalry had been left on solid ground. Now, she was just a sister. And there, in the face of the end, everything that had been left unsaid finally seemed to make sense. Her eyes were calm, but there was something in them, a sadness that came not from pain, but from recognition, the kind of sadness that only those who understand time feel. She touched Arthur's hand gently, as if asking for forgiveness, or maybe just permission. Avalon was not yet visible, only mist, a thick, living mist that enveloped everything with a tenderness the world had never known. It was like sleeping inside a whisper. The crossing would take as long as necessary, because Avalon has no location. It is not a place you can reach with maps. It is a space between worlds, an interval between the end and what might come next. As the boat sailed on, Arthur dreamed, or remembered. It was hard to tell. He saw Camelot standing tall and full of life. He saw Guinevere smiling in a garden, Lancelot riding in the distance, Merlin lighting a candle with his fingers. He saw the round table in its entirety. Everyone there, everyone still believing. He felt the wind of childhood, the touch of the mother he never knew, the sound of his first laugh, and deep within it all, a quiet certainty. He had tried. Avalon began to emerge slowly, first as a reflection, then as an outline, an island that seemed to be made of longing. No grandiose buildings, just gentle hills, ancient trees, flowers that shone even at night. The air was light, the silence dense, as if everything there breathed with a different rhythm. The boat reached the shore without making a sound. The women got out. They carried Arthur in their arms, carefully, as if they were carrying something sacred. Not because he was a king, but because, after all, he was only human. On the island, there was no crown, no throne, no legends, only rest. Avalon does not heal wounds like a miracle. It only offers time to rest, to forget, to stop being a symbol. There, Arthur could finally sleep, and perhaps one day, wake up. Morgana stood beside him. She watched his body slow down. With each breath, the weight of war lifted. With each slow beat of his heart, the sound of battle grew more distant. She knew he would not die here. Not really. Arthur is not a king who dies. He is a king who sleeps, and that difference changes everything. It is said that Avalon holds those who need rest, that there are those whom the world has worn too much, those who have carried more than they should. And Arthur, with his sword, his dreams, his failures, and his stubborn hope, was one of them, the first among many, the most tired, and the most remembered. Outside, the world would go on, without a king, without a center, but with the echo of what was. Arthur's name would not disappear. It would be told, retold, changed. It would become history, song, flag, consolation. Some would say he failed, others that he was betrayed, some that he never existed. But among the winds that touch the ancient seas, one phrase would endure. He will return, because the king who sleeps in Avalon was never just a man. He was an idea. He was an attempt. He was a reminder that even the strongest must stop. And that reminder, in a world that runs without pause, is worth more than any sword. Avalon does not move. It simply exists. Out of time, out of the map, out of haste. It is an island that breathes slowly, as if sleeping between two worlds. There are no walls, no soldiers, no crowds, only ancient trees, calm lakes, and the constant sound of the wind, as if the air itself were remembering what once was. The island demands nothing. It simply welcomes, and forgets along with it. Arthur rests in the center. His body is still there, wrapped in light robes, protected from death by the distance. He no longer dreams, nor does he wake up. He simply remains, as if sleep itself were a form of resistance. There is no urgency. No one calls him, because in Avalon, no one needs to rush back. The island knows how to wait. Morgana takes care of him, not as a witch, nor as an enemy, but as a sister. Her days are silent. She collects leaves, prepares infusions, whispers phrases that no one hears. Sometimes, she sits next to the sleeping king and reads in a low voice, as if she were talking to his memories. Other times, she just stays silent, because at certain moments, silence is more intimate than any words. The other women who live there also perform their rituals. Some were priestesses, others were simply looking for a place where they could breathe without fear. Together, they form a small circle of shade and care. They are presence, never in a hurry. They walk barefoot, gather herbs, and observe the sky as if they were reading ancient letters. They know that everything has a cycle, and that even kings, at some point, must disappear in order to continue existing. The island is lively, but discreet. At night, the stars seem closer. The sky is clear, but never empty. During the day, the sun does not burn. It only warms. Time there does not follow the logic of the world. A day can last weeks. A month can pass in seconds. Avalon does not measure hours. It measures silences. And in these silences, there is healing. Outside, the kingdoms continue. Camelot, now a memory. The empty throne, the rusting swords, the names forgotten or distorted as convenient. Some say Arthur died. Others that he was taken by fairies. Still others believe he turned into a star, watching everything from above. But no one knows about the island. No one finds Avalon. It does not allow itself to be found. It only appears to those who need to forget. The winds that come from the sea carry stories. Some even reach the island. They bring fragments of rumors, echoes of new wars, new kings trying to make good on old promises. Morgana listens but is not moved. She has seen the cycle before. She has seen empires rise, fall, try to pretend they are different. And she knows that, deep down, It is all the same theater, just with new costumes. Every now and then, someone arrives. A lone ship, a man or woman who has given up on the noise. People who have lost everything, or who are tired of winning. They are welcomed in silence. There are no questions, just shelter. And if they want, they can stay. Not forever, just as long as they need. Because Avalon does not bind. It only offers respite. The king does not wake up, but he does not leave either. His presence is constant, like a low fire. There is still strength in him. There is still a name, but there is no hurry. The world outside believes that he can return, that in a time of great need, Arthur will raise his sword again. This belief sustains hope, and perhaps that is why he still sleeps. Because while they wait for him, people still believe that something can change. And the island understands this. It understands that not every legend needs to happen. Some just need to exist, to give breath, to prevent despair, to remember that there was a time when a man tried to do everything right, and almost succeeded. In Avalon, no one talks about the end, because there, nothing ends. It only changes shape. It only breathes more slowly. Stories over time change. They lose pieces, gain shine they never had, change tone. They become reflections of what people need to hear, more than what really happened. And perhaps that is exactly the role of myth, not to tell the literal truth, but to preserve an emotional truth, something that does not fit into dates or suits, but that persists because it touches, because it consoles, because it still makes sense when everything else falls apart. Arthur's story is no different. It has been told in 1,000 ways. In some versions, he is the son of fairies. In others, he is a brutal warrior. Sometimes the sword comes from the stone, sometimes from the lake. Guinevere is a queen or a traitor. Lancelot is a hero or a villain. Mordred is a monster or a victim. It all depends on who tells it and when. But what never changes is the feeling at the heart of the legend, the attempt, the sincere effort, even if flawed, to build something better. Camelot was not perfect. It never was. But what made it special was the desire that it could be, that for once, power and justice could walk side by side, that a king could rule not by fear, but by example, and that, however brief it was, remained. It echoes to this day, in political promises, in stories of just leaders, in dreams of societies that work. Even if no one says it out loud, the shadow of Camelot still moves among us. Merlin knew it from the beginning. He knew that the legend was bigger than the man, that Arthur the individual would not last, but Arthur the symbol, that would last for centuries, because symbols don't have to be real. They just have to be necessary. And there are times when the world needs to believe that someone, somewhere, once tried to make things right. Memory, however, is selective. It forgets the most difficult details. It softens the pain. It erases the contradictions. No one remembers the king's loneliness, nor the nights when Merlin doubted his own gift, nor the anguish of Guinevere, torn between two loves that never asked for a choice. The legend does not keep the weariness. It keeps the conquests. And sometimes this filter is cruel, but it is also what allows the story to continue. Because if we told everything exactly as it was, perhaps no one would be able to bear to hear it. Perhaps the myth would die of disappointment. And with it, the consolation would die. The consolation of believing that good is still possible, that justice can still exist, that the sword can still be wielded by someone worthy, even if it is only in a dream. Avalon, silent, understands this. She doesn't need to prove anything. She doesn't need to explain. She just keeps it. In her mists, she carries memories that the world is not ready to digest, and in doing so, she allows the memory to remain light, that the myth remains alive, because sometimes the whole truth weighs too much, and what heals is only the beautiful part. Some say that all this is made up, that Arthur never existed, that Camelot is fantasy, that Morgana, Merlin, the Grail are nothing more than collective delirium. Maybe so, but even inventions have roots. They are born from some real pain, from some hope that the world has not been able to fulfill. So we create these figures, so that pain has a name, and hope a face. Maybe that's why the legend endures, because there's still something in it that we need in a world that rushes, that demands, that fails. Remembering someone who tried to do things differently is a relief, even if they lost, even if they disappeared, even if you're sleeping on a hidden island. The memory of myth is a candle, small but constant, and a breeze is enough to relight it. Separating history from invention is like trying to separate the mist with your hands. You try, but it slips away. It mixes again. The boundaries blur, and over time, what was fact becomes symbol. What was legend gains the weight of truth. It was like that with Arthur, with Camelot, with the sword, with the Grail, with the island that no one can find on the map, but everyone knows in the depths of their memories. Because in the end, something doesn't need to have really happened for it to truly transform us. Scholars debate. Some say Arthur was a Roman commander, a Celtic warrior, or an obscure king from the 5th century. Others claim he is merely a medieval invention, born in the songs of bards, inflated by monks, and manipulated by kings who needed noble ancestry. Each new century shaped Arthur's figure as it wished. In times of war, he was a symbol of strength. In times of peace, he became the just king. In times of crisis, he was the promise of return. But he was never left aside, perhaps because Arthur, as a legend, is a mirror, and each society sees itself in him as it can. In some reflections, he appears as a ruthless leader, capable of uniting conflicting kingdoms. In others, he is the gentle king who listens before giving orders. In still others, he is a martyr, someone who carries an impossible burden just so the world can have hope for one more day. But what always remains is the feeling that he represented something better, something we have lost, or that we still want to find. Camelot, on the other hand, was never a castle. It was a concept, an experiment in order amidst chaos. The idea that power could be just, that kings could rule with humility, that strength could go hand in hand with ethics. A dream, naive, perhaps, fragile, certainly, but necessary. Because if we don't dream of better versions of ourselves, what's left? The stories were shaped with patience and convenience. The Lady of the Lake, for example, does not appear in the older versions. She was inserted later, just like the Grail itself, which was born at a time when the church needed sacred symbols to give meaning to men's journeys. Morgana, once a healer, became a villain. Merlin, once a druid, became a wizard. The sword gained a name. The table took shape. Everything fit into the theater of the narrative. Because myth needs structure, like a house needs beams. But that doesn't mean it's empty. Quite the opposite. When invention touches the heart, it's more real than any archaeological record. Because it speaks to parts of us that we can't explain, we can only feel. It's not Arthur's name that matters. It's what we feel when we hear it. It's not the location of Camelot that matters. It's the silence that forms when we imagine what it would have been like to live there. History serves to remember, myth to continue, and the two embrace frequently. History gives myth its roots. Myth gives history its soul. And it is in this intertwining that the tales that really matter survive, those that accompany us for centuries. Even when everything changes, we may never know who Arthur was, if he existed, if he fought, if he fell. But the fact that we still talk about him 1,000 years later says it all. Because what makes us human is not what we remember exactly, but what we insist on not forgetting, even without proof. And so we go on, telling and retelling, adjusting the details, coloring the speeches, forgetting the ugliest pains, amplifying the most beautiful gestures, not because we want to lie, but because we need to, because myth helps us imagine, and imagining is, sometimes, the only way to bear reality. Camelot did not fall in a single day. There was no final crash, no fire consuming the walls, all at once. The fall was slow, discreet, almost silent, like a fabric that unravels thread by thread until suddenly it can no longer support its own weight. When the last banner was lowered, when the last door closed, there were no screams, only the sound of the wind rushing through the stones, as if whispering that the dream was over. The kingdom, from the outside, still looked whole. The towers still stood. The bridges stood firm. The halls were empty, but intact. But anyone who walked through the place would feel the absence, not of people, but of purpose. That energy that connected everything, the code, the justice, the promise of a better world, was no longer there. The thread had snapped, and all that was left was the structure, beautiful, but soulless. The few who remained tried to maintain order. They repeated the king's words, kept up the rituals, pretended that everything was still going on. But deep down they knew the heart of Camelot had stopped, and there was no way to revive it with solemnity. The death of the ideal came before physical destruction, when the eyes no longer shine, when smiles are polite, when gestures become mechanical. That was how it ended. Merlin, realizing this, walked away, not out of disappointment, but out of respect. He knew that even the best dreams need to be left alone. Continuing to insist would be like holding on to a lifeless body. He gathered up his books, turned off the lights in his room, and left without warning. Some say he went north, where the mountains are higher and no one demands answers. Others say he turned into the wind, that he only appears now on very silent nights to remind people that there is still wisdom hidden in the mists. The people gradually left. Some returned to their villages. Others sought new kings. Some, tired of following leaders, decided to take care of themselves. No one blamed Arthur. No one blamed Lancelot, or Guinevere, or Morgana. They blamed time, the nature of things, because even the most beautiful dreams carry within them the seed of rupture. And Camelot was, above all, a dream. The round table became a symbol. No one dared touch it. It stood there, covered in dust, surrounded by silence. It was the physical reminder of everything that had been attempted. The carved names, the empty chairs. No words echoed among those stones anymore. No voices discussed justice or courage. Only the echo of absence, the echo of what almost was. Some said that Camelot's mistake was wanting too much, wanting complete justice, absolute loyalty, love without contradiction. A project like that cannot be sustained for long. because the human escapes, desire escapes, fear escapes, and when that happens, ideals crack, not out of malice, but out of limitation. Yet there was beauty, a rare beauty that still resonates with those who hear the story. The attempt to create a place where no one was above others, where the sword was used only as a last resort, where the throne was less important than the word. Camelot did not fail because it made mistakes. It failed because it was too big to last, but perhaps that is what makes it eternal. Not the fact that it existed, but the fact that it was possible, even if only for a short time. A thread of hope stretched to its limit until it broke. But that, in its brief glow, lit the way for others. Other kingdoms, other ideas, other stories. The thread that broke in Camelot, in a way, sewed dreams together in other corners of the world. And that's why we still talk about it, because there's a part of us that refuses to forget that once upon a time, somewhere between myth and reality, someone tried to sew justice and power with the same thread. And even though it broke, the gesture remains. Merlin lived longer than he should have, not by magic, nor by curse, but because some men simply remain, like mountains, like echoes, like the memory of a time the world tries to forget. When Camelot fell, he did not cry, nor did he give a speech. He simply gathered up his cloak, blew out the candles in the tower where he lived, and left before dawn. He left behind unfinished books, forgotten instruments, and letters that would never be read. He took only silence. He walked alone through valleys, forests, and nameless trails. His feet were bare, his gaze lost, as if he were searching and avoiding at the same time. He knew that the world was still turning, that new wars would arise, that new kings would try to raise old thrones. But for him, there was no point in interfering anymore. That time had passed, and with it, the purpose. He found refuge in an ancient grove, where the trees grew in spirals and the birds seemed to whisper. There he built a simple shelter, stone, wood, moss, nothing majestic, just enough to keep out the wind. I spent my days listening to the leaves fall, the branches move, the rain meet the earth. Everything was sound, everything was memory. Sometimes he talked to himself. He repeated names: Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot, Morgana. He said them carefully, as if each syllable still carried something sacred, not with sadness, but with a kind of weary tenderness. He knew that everyone had done what they could. He knew that failure was no one's fault, only time. And wait, on clear nights, he would look at the stars and try to remember when it all began, when he saw the boy who still didn't know he was king, when he believed, even against his own skepticism, that the world could be different. Sometimes he smiled, other times he just breathed. The tiredness he felt wasn't physical, it was from his soul, as if he had spent entire lives trying to whisper truths to ears that only heard promises. Some travelers found his shelter, lost, wounded, confused people. He welcomed them without questions. He offered them tea, silence, and shelter. Sometimes he told stories, not as lessons, but as consolation. He spoke of a king who tried to be fair, of a queen who loved without being able to choose, of a knight who fought against himself, and of an island where time stands still. He never said that he was the one who lived it all. He just narrated, like someone who holds a lit candle for a moment, just to warm the other person. As the years passed, his figure became more of a legend than a man. Some said he had turned into a tree. Others said he slept underground, waiting for a new cycle, but Merlin never expected anything. He just watched, because he knew that everything repeats itself, that the world forgets, rebuilds, dreams again, and despite all this, it keeps moving forward. Merlin's last night was marked by neither thunder nor visions. It was calm. The sky was clear. The wind was light. He sat in front of his hut, wrapped in blankets, with a book open on his lap, but he was not reading. He was just looking, as if he saw something that no one else would see. And perhaps he did. Perhaps he saw, for the last time, the silhouette of Camelot shining among the stars, or the reflection of a sword being returned to the lake, or just the face of a boy pulling a blade from a stone, not knowing what would come next. The next morning, the cabin was empty. The fire was out. The book was still open, but Merlin was no longer there. Not his body, not his footsteps, only silence. The kind of silence that doesn't scare, that only confirms. He left when it was time, without haste, without saying goodbye, and in the woods, where ordinary bushes once grew, there is now a different tree, tall, curved, with leaves that shine when the wind blows. Some say that this is where he rests. Others say that he has become the wind. But no one tries to prove anything, because deep down, everyone understands. Merlin no longer needs to be found. Your work is already done. There are stories that never end. They just rest, like rivers that disappear underground for a while, only to emerge in another place, with another name, but the same water. The legend of Arthur is one of those. It has no endpoint. It has a long, silent pause, shrouded in mist, a wait without a clock, an interval between what was and what might be again. Avalon remains hidden. The island sleeps with the king. Those who believe say that he still breathes, under thin veils, surrounded by mist, guarded by hands that do not age, that his body does not rot, that his soul has not departed. He only waits, not out of will, but out of necessity, because the world still needs him. The myth says Arthur will return when the kingdom is in the greatest danger, when hope is all but gone, when men have forgotten what justice, honor, true courage mean. Then he will open his eyes. He will walk to the lake again, and Excalibur will rise once more, not shining, just steady, as before, as always. Some see this as consolation. Others see it as a warning. Some say he has returned many times before, in other forms, in leaders who placed the common good above their ego, in voices that faced chaos with dignity, in small but firm gestures that kept the world from giving in to despair. Perhaps Arthur doesn't need to appear in full. Perhaps he just needs to be remembered. Because sometimes, remembering is already resisting. Camelot has not been rebuilt. At least, not in the same place. But some say it lives in other realms, in communities that try to be fair, in ideas that do not give in to cynicism, in tables where everyone has a voice. The form has changed. The spirit has not. In every generation, someone retells the story. Someone redraws the king, the wizard, the queen, the knight, the sword, the traitor, the lake. And in doing so, they recreate not just a narrative, but a possibility that, yes, maybe we can do things differently, even if it's just for a little while, even if it's hard, even if it hurts. Arthur became more than a king. He became a memory, and memory, when cared for, becomes a beacon, not to repeat the past, but to remind us of what can be done in the present. Some people laugh at this. Some say that these stories are just a distraction. But perhaps what scares these people the most is precisely the power that the myth still has, the ability to touch, to move, to make us stop and think. Avalon remains hidden, not by magic, but by choice, because the world still has to try for itself, to fail, to try again, and when it is ready, perhaps the mists will part, perhaps the ferry will cross the lake once more, and the bells will ring, not in alarm, but in welcome. But that doesn't have to happen now. For now, the king sleeps. The lake remains quiet. The sword is where it belongs. And we carry on, with uncertain steps, with difficult decisions, with moments of tiredness, but with something inside that insists on not fading. A small voice deep down saying, it can still work out. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Arthur left behind. Not a throne, not a crown, but that voice. One day, the king may return, but until then, the legend lives on with you. Good night.